Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for our final daily dose of Kaldheim spoilers. So really, I didn't even realize it, but Wizard spoiled essentially every single card individually this time. There was no big spoiler dump at the end. So really today we have one rare from the main set left to talk about, a couple of lower rarity cards, and then we got the full Kaldheim Commander deck list. So that's our plan for today. Figured might as well do one last video, kind of wrap things up, talk about the last cards, and also let you know what is to come in the future. So first off, a reminder that if you need any of these Kaldheim cards, or any cards really, you can get them from our awesome sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com. So thank you to Card Kingdom for supporting daily spoilers this whole spoiler season. Also, if you want to see the full set, you want to see the Commander decks, you can head over to MTGPreviews.com where we have all the preview cards up. And finally, even though we're at the end of daily spoilers, we're not near the end of Kaldheim content. Over the next couple of weeks, we will have top 10 lists for Standard and Modern and Historic and Commander. We'll have gameplay content as soon as the set releases, like a week from now on Arena and Magic Online. So tons of Kaldheim stuff going to be coming up, even though we're at the end of spoiler season. But anyway, with that stuff out of the way, let's talk our last few main set Kaldheim cards and then the Commander deck. So last rare in the set, Icebreaker Kraken, 12 mana 8/8 Snow Kraken. It costs 1 less to cast for each snow land you control. So in theory, you get to 12 snow lands, it's going to be free. And then when it enters the battlefield, artifacts and creatures target opponents control don't untap during that player's next untap step. So important to point out, it doesn't actually tap anything, but if your opponent, I don't know, swings all their stuff at you, you can then play this and keep that stuff tapped down for a turn. And then you can return 3 snowlands you control to your hand to return Icebreaker Kraken to your hand. So in theory, if you get enough lands on the battlefield, you can kind of keep doing this on repeat. So Icebreaker Kraken, really, I think it's probably kind of a bulk rare. Maybe if there's a snow deck in Standard, it could show up. I would be more excited about it if it actually taps stuff down. The fact that it doesn't tap stuff, and it only taps stuff that's already tapped, that makes it a lot worse than I was hoping this card would be. That said, we do have good ramp in Standard, so if you want to ramp and tutor out snowlands and try to get this cheap, I mean, worst case, you get up to 6 snowlands. This is a 6 mana 8/8. Those are pretty good stats with a reasonably effective enter the battlefield trigger attached. And if you get up to the late game and top deck this, it's basically going to be a free 8/8, which is not horrible. And I think the coolest part about this card is if you build your deck properly, you can take advantage of the ability to bounce lands back to your hand. Maybe you're playing a landfall style deck. Maybe you got Lotus Cobras or Phallus or Felidare Retreats in Standard. Using Icebreaker Kraken is kind of just like this big body that can then bounce your lands, that you can then replay to trigger your landfall stuff. That does seem pretty sweet, and I think that's probably the main home for this card in Commander as well. One thing I like about this card in Commander is it seems to work really well with like Teyova, Asai, commanders that care about lands entering the battlefield, because they tend to get a lot of lands on the battlefield, and then Icebreaker Kraken comes down very cheaply, even for free. And then after you bounce the lands, you can replay them to trigger your commander again to draw more cards, to get more value. So I think that is sweet, although it is also worth mentioning that its ATB is even worse in Commander than it is in Standard, because it only targets one opponent. It doesn't actually stop all of your opponents, which is a lot less exciting than I would think. Like, Wizards designed so many cards with Commander in mind these days. I would have expected this to keep all of your opponent's artifacts and creatures tapped down. So only hitting one player, a good way to make an enemy. I guess maybe it can like buy you a turn like a weird fog. So Icebreaker Kraken, it has some sweet synergies. Obviously can be big and free if you get enough snowlands on the battlefield. But my guess, this is kind of a bulk rare level card that isn't really going to see all that much play in Standard. Maybe in the landfall commander decks, but even there, I don't know. Is it better than the other options? I guess we'll have to wait and see. We also got Bind the Monster, which is notable for one reason. This is the blue Swords to Plowshares. I know I said this on Twitter and people freaked out at me, and I think it's a fair-ish comparison. 1 mana, aura, enchants a creature. When it enters the battlefield, you tap the enchanted creature, it deals damage to you equal to its power, and then that creature doesn't untap. So it is 1 mana blue hard removal. It is an enchantment, so if it gets blown up, the creature will untap. So really, probably the best comparison, honestly, is Vendetta, like a blue sorcery speed Vendetta. Vendetta, kind of the same text. You blow up a creature, and you lose life equal to its toughness. Bind the Monster, very similar. You get rid of a creature, you take damage equal to its power. The thing is, blue is really bad at removal, so even though this isn't literally Swords to Plowshares, and probably isn't even really Vendetta. For a blue deck that is struggling for removal, 1 mana to deal with anything seems like a pretty good deal. So I think this card could potentially be playable. So keep this one in mind, even though it's a lowly common. We also got another Angel, Vengeful Reaper. So 4 mana, but you can foretell it for 2. Angel Cleric, Flying, Death Touch, Haste. This is kind of a bad Vampire Nighthawk, I guess. Losing the lifelink is a big deal, but the combination of Flying, Haste, and Death Touch potentially coming down on turn 3 is pretty powerful, and it is an Angel and a Cleric, 2 tribes that are relevant for Standard, so I don't know if this card's actually going to be good, but it's close enough to some past cards that have seen play that I think it's worth mentioning at a minimum. So that does it for all of our cards from the main set. However, we do have 2 Kaldheim Commander decks to break down. So the Kaldheim Commander decks, just so it's doubly, triply, super duper ultra clear, these cards are not legal in Standard, or in Historic, or in Pioneer or Modern. They're legal in Commander, they're legal in Legacy, Vintage, of course, kitchen table casual play. So don't be thinking of these cards in the context of Standard, because they're not even legal there. But we have Phantom Premonition. This is the blue-white foretell deck, and on top of the cards we'd already seen, like the Commander, we have a few new rares to talk about. So this is all the new cards that we got today from the deck. We're going to break them down one by one really quickly. And again, not Standard legal, so focus here on Commander primarily. Ethereal Valkyrie, kind of an interesting threat for a foretell deck. A 6 mana 4/4 with Flying. Spirit Angel, when it enters the battlefield or attack, you draw a card. Then you essentially foretell a card from your hand, which is kind of powerful. ETB, draw a card, attack, draw a card, and a little rampy bonus thanks to foretell. I could see this being good in, of course, foretell decks. You're going to want all the good foretell stuff you can get. It is good enough for, like, Raynar. Also has some, like, Panharmonicon synergies, doubling up the trigger. Maybe some blink value with Brago could be interesting. We also got Tales of the Ancestors, which is essentially a bad windfall. 4 mana, each player with fewer cards in hand than the player with the most cards in hand draws cards to equal the difference. Foretell of 2. Why is this a bad version of windfall? And the biggest reason isn't that it costs 1 more mana. You can kind of get around that with foretell to some extent. The biggest reason is one of the ways to break windfall is you have a bunch of cards in hand, and then you can get a bunch more cards in hand. If you are the player with the most cards, Tale of the Ancestors does literally nothing. You can't just wheel away a bunch of lands to draw new cards, so keep that in mind. On the other hand, if you dump your hand and someone else has a bunch of cards in hand, this is a way that you and everyone else can draw back up to the most cards at the table. We also got Spectral Deluge, which is quite literally the spell version of Scourge of the Fleet. Scourge of the Fleets, when it enters the battlefield, to return each creature your opponents control with toughness X or less to their hand, where X is the number of islands you control. The text on Spectral Deluge, it is exactly the same, except it's a 6 mana sorcery that you can foretell for 3. Also, like a little bit of a comparison to Cyclonic Rift, although way, way worse. But this could be, especially for a mono blue deck that is all islands, could be like a budget Cyclonic Rift replacement. Scourge of the Fleets does see a bit of play in ramp decks and also sea creature decks. Spectral Deluge, if you can foretell it for 3 mana, that's pretty efficient, although keep in mind, since it triggers based on the number of islands you have, flipping this up on turn 3, probably not going to do a whole lot. Like, you're going to bounce small creatures, so to really get max power, you're going to need a bunch of islands and have this be a late game effect anyway, but the foretell is still nice because you can do it cheaply and then play other spells in the same turn, which is better probably than just running out Scourge of Fleets and having it be your turn. Spectral Deluge for 3 plus a 4-drop or something is a nice little bonus if you can foretell it cheaply. We also got Sage of the Beyond, which is one of the more interesting cards we've seen from the Raynar Commander deck. 7 mana 5/5 fly. You could foretell it for 5 mana, and then spells you cast from anywhere other than your hand cost 2 less to cast. So this is obviously built to work with foretell. That's the idea, is to play it with Raynar. Your foretell cards cost 2 less. On the other hand, it works with any spell you're not casting from your hand. So this gives you a discount if you're escaping cards with Underworld Breach, let's say. It gives you a discount if you steal all your opponent's cards from their graveyards, put them in exile with Mnemonic Betrayal. Then all of a sudden you're getting a 2 mana discount there. It works with Flashback. So a thing I like about Sage of Beyond, yes, it works well with Raynar, but it works in a bunch of other places as well. 7 mana is a lot, so I don't think it's broken, but it is a cool synergistic card. We also got Stoic Farmer, which is the return of Core Cartographer, essentially, I'm not even sure it's better than Core Cartographer. When it enters the battlefield, you search your library for a plains and reveal it. If your opponent controls more lands than you put it onto play tapped. Otherwise, it goes to your hand. You can't foretell it for 2. Core Cartographer is kind of a staple mono white ramp spell because white isn't all that good at ramping. Stoic Farmer, it's essentially Core Cartographer with more drawbacks and maybe a more relevant creature type, but really, more Core Cartographers is not a horrible thing. We also got Hero of Guard, a pretty interesting 3-drop. 3-mana human warrior. Whenever you exile 1 or more cards from your hand or permanents from the battlefield, put that many counters on it. As long as it has 5 or more counters, it has flying and it's an angel. Once it gets to 10 counters, it is indestructible and a god as well. So again, this is a card that it works with Raynar and Foretell stuff because you're exiling those cards from your hand, slowly growing it, although probably the most devastating home for Hero is going to be a Blink style deck. Like, you play this, you Eerie Interlude, you blink all your other creatures, that's going to put a ton of counters on Guard. Or maybe you have Brago and you're blinking a bunch of permanents every single turn, you're going to make this into a massive god really quickly. So even though it does work with Foretell, even more exciting I think in Blink decks. Finally today, oh boy, one of the scarier cards, I think, from the set, Cosmic Intervention, 4-mana instant. If a permanent you control would be put in your graveyard from the battlefield this turn, exile it, and then return it to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. You can foretell it for 2. So on level 1, this is Wrath Protection, similar to like Boros Charm, making all your permanents pseudo-indestructible. You're like, yes, they're dying, but then they're coming back, and in some ways it's better than indestructible because you can reuse all of your ETB triggers. Although what I think the most devastating and probably spikiest thing to do with this card is just foretell it, get up to 6 mana, and then you cast Cosmic Intervention, and then you Armageddon. Your opponents lose all of their lands. You lose all of your lands, but only for a second because on the next end step, they're all going to come back into play. So that's pretty scary. Could also do some sweet janky things with like Hellcarver Demon or with Scape Shift, other mass sacrifice effects. So really, it's very similar to Face Reward, except probably just a better Face Reward because you can foretell it for 2 mana rather than cast it for 4, which makes it a lot easier to have enough mana to like Armageddon, Cosmic Intervention in the same turn. So Cosmic Intervention, one of the scarier cards I think from the Azorius Kaldheim Commander deck. Finally today, our last Commander deck, Elven Empire, a green-black elf deck, and this one also has a bunch of new cards, and let's break them down briefly like we did with the last deck. So Elder Fang Venom, 4-mana enchantment, gives your attacking elves Death Touch, and when an elf you control dies, each opponent loses a life and you gain a life. So essentially, it's a 4-mana enchantment version of Blood Artist that also has some nice synergy with some of your elf payoffs, like Azori Renegade Leader, Overrun. Things that trample up your team are really powerful with Death Touch because each creature can just give 1 damage to your opposing creatures and then send the rest at your opponent's face. Also potentially allows you to swing in with your small, like 1/1 elf tokens, even through your opponent's blockers, because who's going to want to throw a real creature in front of a little death-touching elf? So allows you to be aggressive with your elves and does punish your opponent for board wipes and so forth with the Blood Artist text. We also got Crown of Skemfar, essentially an aura version of Timberwatch Elf, 4 mana, you enchant a creature, it gets +1/+1 for each elf you control and reach, and you can pay 3 to return it from your graveyard to your hand. So Timberwatch Elf, taps to pump equal to the number of elves on the battlefield. This is kind of the aura version. You put it on an elf, hopefully getting a bunch of damage. If the creature dies, you can put it back into your hand from the graveyard, put it back on another elf, keep going to town. So it gives you a go tall plan to go along with elves, common flood the board with small creature go wide plan. We also got Bounty of Skemfar, which is essentially like a weird cultivate, 3-mana sorcery. Reveal the top 6 cards of your library, you put a land from them onto the battlefield tapped and an elf from among them into your hand, the rest go on the bottom. So this is, think of it like a cultivate, except rather than getting the extra land in your hand, you're getting an elf in your hand. Is that better than cultivate or Kadabba's Reach? I don't know. You also got to consider there is a whiff factor. Like if you don't have any lands in your top 6 or any elves in your top 6, you're not guaranteed to get 2 cards out of it. I think most of the time I would rather have a elf plus a land, especially since it hits non-basics, than 2 lands in an elf deck. The other consideration is elf decks often use creatures as a ramp plan because elves are really good at making mana, which means cards like Cultivate and Kadama's Reach go down in value. So I'm kind of on the fence. I can see what this card is trying to do. Will it be good enough to show up in elf decks? We'll have to wait and see. We also got Ruthless Winnower, which is Anawa the Ruin Sage, but for elves. At the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player sacks a non-elf creature. If you are playing exclusively elves, then this is just all upside. Your opponents have to keep sacking stuff. You don't have to stack stuff. So I feel like, just like Anwan is pretty good in a vampire deck, Ruthless Winnower should be pretty good in black-green elves. We also got our last card, Serpent Soul Jar. 3-mana artifact. When an elf dies, you exile it, then you can pay 2 life and tap Serpent Soul Jar. Until end of turn, you may cast a creature spell from among the cards exiled with Serpent Soul Jar. So essentially, this is like Elf Lures. You just play this, have it on the battlefield. Each turn after your elves start dying, for the cost of 2 life, you can keep casting your elves from exile. Only 1 per turn, so good wrath protection, good removal protection. I think it is probably good enough to show up in some elf decks. Oh yeah, I guess that wasn't the last card. We also got Pact of the Serpent, which is pretty good card draw spell. Choose a creature type, target player draws X and loses X life, where X is the number of creatures they control of the chosen type. This is essentially Distant Melody, but -1 mana and with the black drawback of losing life. Distant Melody sees a reasonable amount of play as a card draw effect in tribal decks. Pact of the Serpent, I expect the same thing. If you're playing a go-wide tribal deck, this is a really solid card draw option for your deck. So it's good in elves, but it's probably good in other go-wide black-based tribes as well. Also want to mention really quickly some reprints. Wasn't anything super exciting in the Azorius deck. Yes, you did get a Soul Ring and an Arcane Signet. They go in every deck. In elves, though, you get a Reese the Exiled, which wasn't exciting a couple of weeks ago, but it got bought out last week, and now it's like $20. So that's going to pay for a huge chunk of your commander deck, although I expect the price is going to be coming back down. So anyway, that brings us to the end of our daily Kaldheim spoilers for today. So let me know what you think. What do you think of the commander decks? What do you think of the set in general? What cards are you most excited for? Let me know in the comments. And like I said before, check out the previews, mtgpreviews.com. Pick out the cards you need over at cardkingdom.com. And we'll be back soon with top 10 lists, gameplay, and tons of other Kaldheim stuff. So until then, everyone, thanks so much for hanging out this spoiler season. I hope you enjoyed it. Have a wonderful day, and I will talk to you soon. Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, help us out by clicking that like button down below. And to keep up on all the latest and greatest, click that subscribe button. And don't forget to hit that bell icon to get alerts whenever we have new videos. And if you want to, check out some of our other sweet videos here and here.